All right, let's get into it. Number 10. The Felony Murderer. You're in a courtroom in Texas, 1980. Three men robbed a house on New Year's Eve. They bound the people inside and shot each one in the head. Two of them died. One survived. All three men went to death row. One of them was still there in 2022, nearly 40 years later, still saying he didn't pull the trigger. He was executed at 76 years old. That's the most common person on death row in America. Not a serial killer, not a terrorist, a man who was there when someone got killed. Felony murder is the charge when a killing happens during another serious crime, whether or not it was planned: robbery, burglary, kidnapping, sexual assault. If someone dies during any of those, everyone in the room can face murder charges. In about half of the states that still have the death penalty, that includes a death sentence. The law draws a line, technically. You have to be more than the guy waiting in the car. You have to have been a major player, someone who acted without caring if people died. But here's what most people don't get. That line gets drawn differently depending on where you're tried. The same set of facts, the same level of involvement produces a death sentence in one county and a life sentence 30 miles away. That's not an anomaly. That's the system. Only 2% of counties in this country have produced the majority of executions since 1976. 2%. So the biggest factor in whether a felony murderer ends up on death row isn't what they did. It's where they did it. On the row, men convicted of felony murder where they weren't the actual killer carry a specific bitterness that everyone around them recognizes. The ones who pulled the trigger sometimes have a kind of grim ownership of their situation. The ones who drove the car or stood outside don't. They are still legally just as guilty. The court said so. The jury agreed. The needle is still scheduled. That dynamic plays out in a quiet way through a small group of men in a tight space year after year. The felony murder category is the largest single group on death row. Most people don't know that. Most people picture someone very different. The killer in the next category never touched anyone. He made a phone call, he moved some money, and he's just as dead. Number 9, the Murder-for-Hire Orchestrator. The call gets made from a landline, a cell phone, a wire transfer, a meeting in a parking lot. Sometimes the person on the other end is a friend with a criminal history. More often, he's an undercover cop. The plan moves through a chain of people, documented at every step, and then it all comes apart. In most of these cases, the person who hired the killer never held a weapon at any point in their life. Murder for hire is almost always domestic. A spouse during a divorce, a business partner who became a liability, an estranged family member with an estate attached. The professional contract killer, the type from movies, basically doesn't exist in the real American criminal record. When people try to hire one, they ask around, and that chain of asking leads almost inevitably to law enforcement. In Texas, in the mid-90s, a man arranged for 2 other people to kill his wife during a custody dispute. All 3 ended up sentenced to death: the man who paid, the man who pulled the trigger, and the man who connected them. Legally, they were all equally guilty. In practice, the one who made the phone call is usually the one who stays on the row longest, because the shooter often cooperates and takes a deal. The person who ordered the death serves more time waiting for execution than the person who carried it out. That's not unusual. That's how these cases tend to go. The orchestrators who arrive on death row are different from almost everyone else there. Older, often middle class, no prior record. They arrive believing their attorneys will fix it. By the 5th year, that belief is mostly gone. Guards describe them as easier to manage than other condemned inmates, not because they've adapted, but because they're terrified and they comply. They didn't know the rules of this world going in. By the time they've learned them, it doesn't matter anymore. Because these murders were planned from a distance, there's usually more evidence in these cases than in almost any other capital crime. Phone records, texts, bank transfers. The documentation is thorough. That's part of what buries them. Federal law still makes murder for hire a capital offense when death results and any part of the communication crossed a state line. One phone call can be enough. There's a type on the row who used their badge to protect people for years before they used it for something else. That's a different kind of case entirely. Number 8, the killer cop. You walk into a condemned unit and you ask who's who. Within the first week, word moves fast in a small space. Former law enforcement don't announce themselves, but they don't have to. Someone always knows. And in a unit full of men who spent their lives on the other side of that relationship, there is no anonymity and no neutral ground. Killing a police officer is one of the fastest paths to a death sentence in almost every state that still has capital punishment. The victim's badge functions as an aggravating factor all on its own. But the category cuts both ways. Officers who commit murder go through the same courts under the same laws, and when their crimes carry the right combination of factors, they end up exactly where their former colleagues sent other people for decades. It's rare. Not because officers who commit serious crimes are rare, but because the cases that produce capital charges require the same stack of aggravating factors as any other murder case. Multiple victims, extreme cruelty, a premeditated plan. When those line up, the sentence doesn't change based on what the person used to do for a living. In Louisiana, a uniformed officer on active patrol was sentenced to death for murders committed while she was still carrying a badge. The case drew national attention not because it was legally unusual, but because the image of it was. An officer in uniform. Arrests on one end of her career, death row on the other. Former law enforcement inside condemned units are not held separately in most facilities, just quietly positioned with some degree of distance from the general condemned population. But a death row unit holds maybe 30 men in most states. There is no real distance. Everyone knows who everyone is. That gets to you after a while, watching a man live out his sentence surrounded by people who know exactly what he was. The data on whether executing cop killers reduces the number of officers killed in the line of duty is not complicated. The states with the lowest rates of officer killings are the ones that have stopped doing executions. The official justification and the real outcome have never lined up on that one. There is another kind of killer who doesn't target one person or even a handful. He targets the same type of victim over months and years, and he's done it before you even knew there was a pattern. Number 7, the serial killer. Here's the thing, most people don't get about serial killers on death row. They're the minority. Most people sitting in a condemned unit killed one person. One victim, one event, one night that went a direction no one came back from. The men who killed 5, 10, 30 people, the men with files that fill a filing cabinet, they're the face of death row in documentaries and true crime and the public imagination. They're not the face of the actual population. The peak era for recorded serial killing in America ran roughly from the early 70s to the late 90s. Around 70% of all documented serial murders in this country happened during that window. Since then, the numbers have dropped. DNA databases, better communication between law enforcement agencies across state lines, fewer people hitchhiking. The infrastructure for that kind of long-running predation got harder to work inside. 2 names define the cultural image of the executed serial killer. Ted Bundy killed at least 30 women across multiple states during the 70s. He was executed in Florida in 1989, 10 years after his conviction. His final meal was steak and eggs. He didn't touch it. His execution drew a crowd outside the prison that was celebrating. John Wayne Gacy killed 33 boys and young men in Illinois, buried many of them under his house, and was executed in 1994. His IV line clogged during the lethal injection. The curtain closed. They fixed it. The curtain opened again. He was dead 18 minutes after they started. His last meal was a bucket of fried chicken, French fries, fried shrimp, a pound of strawberries, and a Diet Coke. Both men were executed. Many equally prolific killers from the same era died in prison beds from old age and illness, untouched by execution, simply because they were convicted in the wrong state or the wrong county. From inside the condemned unit, serial killers with high public profiles get more mail than anyone. More interview requests, more documentary attention, more contact with the outside world. The ordinary condemned man, the one who killed one person in one county 15 years ago, watches that and does not find it funny. The serial killer selects targets individually, one at a time, over months or years. The next category doesn't wait that long. Number 6, the mass murderer. You walk into a courtroom where the facts aren't in dispute. Everyone already knows what happened and who did it. The entire trial is about one thing: what to do with this person now. That's what mass murder cases look like inside the legal system. Guilt is almost never the argument. The argument is punishment. Mass murder, defined as multiple people killed in a single event, produces a death sentence when specific conditions line up: premeditation, ideological motive, high victim count. The trial becoming, in effect, a sentencing hearing from the start. 2 cases define this category as it currently sits on federal death row. In 2015, a man walked into a church in South Carolina and shot 9 people during a Bible study session. He was tried at the federal level, sentenced to death in 2017, and explicitly excluded from a mass commutation of federal death sentences in late 2024. He's in Terre Haute, Indiana, currently on death row with no execution date set. In 2018, a man shot 11 people at a synagogue in Pittsburgh on a Saturday morning. Deadliest anti-Semitic attack in American history. He was sentenced to death in 2023. He was also excluded from that same commutation. Both men remain on federal death row alongside the Boston Marathon bomber. Those 3 are now essentially the entire known ideological contingent of the federal condemned. Here's what most people don't realize. The vast majority of the biggest mass shootings of the last 20 years produced no death sentences at all. The shooter died at the scene. The state didn't have capital punishment. The prosecutor declined to seek it. Mass murder doesn't automatically mean death row. It means you're eligible. What actually happens depends on venue and timing and prosecutorial decision-making. Guards describe the settling-in period for mass murderers as the strangest adjustment to watch. They arrive under heightened security, psychiatric observation, administrative protocols. Within a few months, they're on the same schedule as everyone else. Slot opens, tray goes in. 1 hour of exercise. Repeat. The person who defined a news cycle becomes indistinguishable from the rest of the row. That's the thing that's hard to explain to someone who's never been in one of those units. Terrorism, legally speaking, is a different category, though the line between mass murder and terrorism blurs in the specific cases that have actually produced federal executions. Number 5, the terrorist. The federal death penalty explicitly covers terrorism when people die. In practice, almost no one ends up on death row specifically as a terrorist. They die in the attack. They're tried in states that don't have capital punishment. They take a deal. The overlap between person who committed an act of terrorism and person currently on death row is very small. The clearest case in American history is Oklahoma City, 1995. A truck bomb brought down a federal building. 168 people died, including 19 children. The man behind it was sentenced to death 2 years later. He waived his appeals. He was executed in 2001, 4 years after sentencing, which is almost unheard of fast in a federal capital case. He had no final statement. He requested no spiritual advisor. He watched his own reflection in the observation chamber glass as the injection began. The Boston Marathon bomber was sentenced to death in 2015. His conviction was overturned on appeal in 2020. The Supreme Court put it back in 2022. He's at Terre Haute right now, more than 12 years after the bombing, with no execution date scheduled. That's what the federal capital system actually looks like for terrorism cases. The law says death is available. The system's actual pace looks like something else entirely. The Terre Haute unit, where federal condemned prisoners are held, houses a handful of men. It's quiet in a specific way that's different from state death rows. Communications are monitored more thoroughly. Contact with outside sympathizers is restricted. One person who worked there described it as feeling like a waiting room with no windows, just a small number of men in a very controlled space waiting for something that may or may not come. 3 men on federal death row were explicitly left out when nearly 40 other federal death sentences were commuted to life in late 2024. Those 3 are the ones the world already knows. Everyone else got commuted. Those 3 didn't. The cases in the next category are not about strangers or ideology. They're about the people closest to you. And they send more people to death row than almost anything else. Number 4. The domestic killer. The tray comes through the slot, and somewhere down the tier, a man who killed his own children gets up to eat. Nobody talks to him much. That's not a rule anyone wrote down. It's just how it goes. Domestic murder is one of the most common underlying crimes in death row sentences, and it almost never gets discussed as a category. Most conversations about the condemned focus on the stranger danger cases, the ones that make the news. But a large portion of the people sitting in condemned units are there for something that happened inside a house, between people who knew each other, often for a long time before it ended the way it did. What pushes a domestic killing to a capital charge is the same thing that pushes any murder there: aggravating factors, multiple victims in one event, the victim being a child, the method showing exceptional cruelty, a prior record of violence in the relationship. About half of all states with capital punishment list the killing of a child as a standalone factor that can make murder eligible for death. That means a parent who kills their own child in certain states faces the same legal threshold as a stranger who abducted and murdered someone else's. Family annihilators, the ones who kill an entire household in a single event, receive capital sentences at high rates in death penalty states. Arson cases where a child dies in a set fire come up repeatedly. Several states add the victim's pregnancy to the list of factors that can elevate the charge. Women are a small percentage of the condemned population, around 50 out of roughly 2,500 total. But among those women, domestic murder is disproportionately the crime. Several are on death row for the deaths of their children. A few are there for the deaths of abusive partners. In those cases, the legal question of where victimhood ends and culpability begins has been debated for decades and hasn't been resolved. Inside the condemned unit, men who killed their own children sit at the bottom of whatever informal hierarchy exists among people who are all, by definition, on the bottom. Gang killers and robbery murderers look down on them openly. Corrections staff describe the child killer cases as the ones that stay with them, not because of how these inmates behave inside. Most of them are quiet and compliant, but because of what's in the file. You do the job, you deliver the tray, you know what you know. The next category kills on orders, inside a structure, with people above and below, and a specific set of rules about who lives and who doesn't. Number 3, the gang and organized crime killer. The first federal execution in the modern era wasn't a serial killer. It wasn't a terrorist. It was a drug trafficker convicted of 3 murders in Texas as part of a border state drug operation. That case, in 2001, set the template. That's what most people on federal death row actually are. People connected to criminal organizations who killed to protect the business or eliminate competition. Federal law makes it a capital offense to commit murder as part of a drug trafficking conspiracy or to protect a criminal enterprise. That covers a wide range of things: executions of rivals, killings that silence witnesses, murders carried out on orders from above. MS-13. Cartel-connected operations, street-level organizations with enough structure to qualify as a criminal enterprise under federal law. Multiple members of those organizations have been sentenced to death in federal prosecutions. When a nearly 40-person mass commutation of federal death sentences happened in late 2024, the majority of the people whose sentences were reduced were in this category. Not terrorists, not serial killers, gang and organized crime murderers. That's who filled the majority of federal death row. Most people outside the system don't know that. Trust me on this. Gang-affiliated men arrive on the row better prepared for incarceration than almost anyone else there. They've done time before, they know the routines, they have networks on the outside. But death row is specifically designed to end networks. Solitary confinement doesn't care how connected you were. A man who ran 100 people inside general population shows up in a unit of 30 strangers, gets a slot in a door, and gets 1 hour of exercise in a cage the size of a parking spot. The structure he built and operated for years means nothing in that room. Capital prosecutions in this category depend heavily on cooperating witnesses, other gang members who took deals in exchange for testimony. That testimony gets challenged in case after case. Several death sentences in this category have been appealed on the grounds that the cooperating witness had every reason to lie, and the state knew it. The federal government now prosecutes gang murder and organized political violence under the same statutes. That positioning, criminal enterprise murder and terrorism treated as legally equivalent categories, tells you something about how the system frames these cases. Whether that framing survives contact with the actual facts of each case is a different question. The next category is the one that closes courtrooms, the one that produces verdicts before the defense is finished, the category that most reliably ends in death row and most reliably ends in catastrophic error. Number 2, the predatory child killer. You sit in a jury box and you hear what was done to a child. The evidence comes in, the photographs get passed, and the question of guilt stops being complicated almost immediately. These are the cases where death sentences get returned fastest, where jurors who started the trial saying they could keep an open mind stop having an open mind, where the defense attorney's job becomes almost entirely about mitigation because the guilt phase barely exists. The sexual murder of a child is the category that most consistently produces capital sentences across diverse jurisdictions, across different counties, across states with very different prosecution cultures. About half of all states with capital punishment list child murder as a standalone factor. You don't need anything else. That's enough. The archetypal case in this category involves a stranger predator, a child abducted, sexual violence, a body found days or weeks later. The killer had no prior relationship with the victim. He selected them. That case, more than any other type, produces unanimous jury verdicts for death. And here's the thing that has to be said plainly. This category has produced more wrongful convictions than almost any other in the capital system. The pressure to solve a child murder is unlike the pressure in any other case. Law enforcement works these files around the clock. Prosecutors take them personally. Juries come in emotionally primed. That combination creates exactly the conditions where everything can go wrong. Coerced confessions from people who didn't understand what they were signing. False forensic evidence, including arson science that entire states used for decades before it was challenged and overturned. Eyewitness identifications that couldn't hold up. In North Carolina, 2 brothers spent decades on death row for the murder of a child before DNA evidence cleared them in 2014. A Supreme Court justice had cited that very case years earlier as a clear moral justification for capital punishment. The citation came first. The exoneration came 20 years after it. Inside any prison, child killers and sexual murderers are at the bottom. In general population, they're targets. On death row, solitary confinement keeps them physically safe, but the stigma is known and it's universal. Other condemned men don't hide how they feel about them. Guards have seen it across every facility they've worked. These inmates behave fine inside. They follow rules, they don't cause trouble, and the other men on the row would watch them go to the chamber without grief. About 1 in 4 death row exonerations since 1973 involves a case where a child was the alleged victim. The category most likely to send someone to death row is the category most likely to send the wrong person there. That leaves one category. It isn't a crime type. It's what happens when every other category gets it wrong. Number 1, the wrongly convicted. They don't have a crime in common. They don't have a profile. You can't pick them out by the type of case or the type of victim or the type of night that produced the arrest. They're scattered through every other category on this list. There's a wrongly convicted felony murderer, a wrongly convicted domestic killer, a wrongly convicted man sitting on death row right now for the sexual murder of a child he never touched. The wrongly convicted aren't a type. They're the error rate. About 1 in 25 people sentenced to death didn't do it. That's the floor. That's the lowest estimate, and most people who study this think the real number is higher. Since 1973, more than 200 people have walked off death row after being exonerated. For every 8 people executed, 1 other person on the row has had their conviction thrown out. That ratio has held for decades. The average time between conviction and exoneration as of 2024 is 38 years, the highest it's ever been. That number has more than doubled over the past 20 years because the cases getting cleared now are the old ones, the ones from before DNA testing, the ones built on coerced confessions and eyewitness testimony and forensic science that has since been discredited. Men who were convicted in the 70s and 80s are being cleared in their 60s and 70s, if they're cleared at all. Let me tell you what that actually looks like from inside the unit. A man who is guilty and knows it reaches a kind of accommodation with his situation over time. His appeals are his appeals. His lawyers are working. He waits. A man who is innocent cannot reach that accommodation. He writes letters. He reviews transcripts. He tracks down witnesses from a cell with a slot in the door. He does law in a place with no law library access most days. He does not stop. Every person who has been exonerated from death row and been asked about it says something close to the same thing. The day they almost stopped fighting was the day they nearly didn't make it back. You cannot identify them from outside. They behave the same way. They occupy the same cells. The same tray comes through the same slot. They wait the same years. Some of them are executed before anyone finds what was in the file. There is no mechanism in the American legal system to formally declare a person innocent after they have been executed. None. The appeals process closes when the execution happens. Evidence that surfaces after that has nowhere to go. What gets found gets filed. What gets filed stays there. That's the thing that stays with you. Here's the pattern across all 10 of these categories. The thing you see when you've been around the system long enough to stop being surprised by any single case and start seeing the shape of all of them together. Death row is not where the worst killers in America end up. It's where some of them end up. Whether any specific killer ends up there depends on what state they're in, what county within that state, which prosecutor is running for re-election that year, and whether they could afford a lawyer who knew what they were doing. The FBI tracks murder data across the country. The worst murders happen everywhere. Death sentences happen in 2% of counties. Those aren't the 2% with the worst murders. They're the 2% with the most aggressive prosecution culture, the longest tradition of seeking death, the most compliant juries. The cultural picture of death row is serial killers and terrorists. The reality is felony murders, domestic violence cases, and men tried in border counties by prosecutors who have made capital punishment a professional habit. There are roughly 2,500 people in condemned units across this country right now. Most of them are there for killing one person. Most of them will die in that cell of something other than execution. The average person on death row has been there for over 19 years. California has nearly 600 condemned inmates. It has carried out 13 executions since 1976. There are men who arrived young, grew old, and died there without ever being executed, which means they spent their entire adult lives in a cell waiting for something that never happened. The wrongly convicted sit at number 1, not because their case is the most dramatic, but because they represent the true weight of what the other 9 categories mean. Every time the system gets it wrong at the level of death row, it does so in a case that went through every safeguard: a jury convicted, a judge sentenced, an appeals process reviewed. And somewhere in that chain, a fact that mattered didn't surface, or a witness lied, or a piece of science was wrong in a way no one had caught yet. The official version says the process exists to prevent that. The real version is that the process creates the conditions for that, because it is long and expensive, and the quality of your representation depends almost entirely on where you were arrested and what you could afford. The math on how many people have been executed for crimes they didn't commit is not a number anyone can state precisely. That's the thing the system can't account for. You can't run the DNA after someone's already been buried. 202 people have walked out of condemned units exonerated since 1973. They walked past the slot in the door, past the tray, past the men they'd known for 20 or 30 years, out into a world that had kept moving without them. Most of them were middle-aged or older. Some were elderly. Some had been in there since they were teenagers. Every one of them had been convicted by a jury. Everyone had a judge sign the sentence. Everyone had a file that said, with the full weight of state authority, that they belonged there. You've now spent the better part of an hour inside that system. Most people skip around in these videos, catch a few items, move on. You stayed through all of it. If something in here settled differently than you expected, leave it in the comments. Tell me which one hit you and why. If you're not subscribed, now's the moment. The slot in the door opens at the same time every day. The tray goes in. The tray comes out. It happens whether the man inside did it or not. It happens in California and in Texas and in a small unit in Indiana where 3 men sit under fluorescent lights with no scheduled execution date and no windows. It has been happening for decades, and it will keep happening in cells that most people will never see to men who most people will never know. The system calls it justice. The math on what it actually is belongs to you now.